This is a great way to start the week. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Graeme and Alex MacDonald on the show today. This is going to be really fun. Hopefully we'll get lots of questions, so this can be really interactive. I think there's already 100 people watching this, so it's pretty cool. And we just turned the thing on like a minute ago, and which is awesome. So thanks guys for your time. I'm jealous because Alex is wearing a short sleeve shirt and it's pretty cold here in New York. But before we dive in, I'm just curious, since obviously we're now living in this world with this, these very almost surreal conditions, what is the mood like there in Oakville and in Napa Valley? What's going on?
I'll speak and Graeme can jump in too. We've been pretty fortunate for us in our little slice here because we got to finish all of our pruning before shelter in place hit, and then the last couple weeks Graeme mowing, so we've been able to kind of continue doing business as normal within the vineyard and whatnot. But obviously there's a lot of people affected by this and dealing with some really challenging things, whether it's health issues or losing jobs and whatnot. So we've been always reaching out to friends and checking in with people that have kind of been more on the front line of these things and understanding what they're going through and hopefully being able to support them throughout whatever they need.
Yeah. What's your view? What are you seeing, Graeme?
It's just quiet. It reminds me of the stories our grandparents told us about the 1970s before tourism took off. So I just feel like there's an eerie quiet. I mean, we're sort of self-isolating by nature with young kids. So me being on the tractor is not all that different from a normal day, but the commute home is zero traffic and very few cars.
Yeah, it's a lot easier being able to take that left across Highway 29 to go to Santa Elena right now.
Yeah, you're not risking your life every time you get on the road, but also raising small kids is a heroic task. So, I feel for you. Been there, but not like this. Anyway, Graeme, you mentioned something that I think is really central to sort of your whole family. You mentioned the word family, and obviously you guys have a tremendous lineage that I think our viewers would find really interesting. I love some of the photos you sent earlier about your dad with a Chenin Blanc, pictures of Robert Mondavi. So tell us a little bit, for people who don't know your history and your story, tell us a little bit about the family and this connection to this piece of property.
Yeah, so Alex and I are fourth generation Napa Valley grape growers. Our great grandparents purchased a small portion of the historic To Kalon Vineyard back in 1954, and when they did that, they were forced to buy land. They didn't think it would be a good investment at the time. So I looked it up in my great uncle's memoir, and they paid $600 per acre back then for 35 acres in a little farmhouse. And so it's sort of been a family heirloom in many senses with stewarding this vineyard. And we've gone through a lot of different plantings from Chenin Blanc, Johannesburg Riesling, all sorts of, apparently the Riesling wasn't that great, but the Chenin was. I heard Tegan mention it when you interviewed him the other day. Yeah. And we've been very lucky. It's a heritage vineyard. Every generation has planted a different vineyard block that still exists today. So just based on being a small family business, we've kept a lot of the grapes in the ground, and we're incredibly grateful because it allows us to make grapes from old vines.
Cool. And so before we get into the details, if you don't mind, this is our map of Oakville, just to sort of situate everybody. And I hadn't looked at this map in a while, but the first thing that struck out to me is like, I know when I'm driving here, which is Highway 29, you think you're going north, but you're not really going north. You're going northwest, on this road. And you guys are here. So this whole thing here is To Kalon, and you guys are here. So what's unique about your piece of that vineyard?
So part of getting excited about a multi-generational family vineyard is there is a genealogy of the land, and the people who farmed it before us even are part of our genealogy. And I can see that when I'm out there driving a tractor, and you can see decisions soil management wise and that people have made throughout time. And Alex and I have been very lucky because we ran into geologists when we were getting more and more interested. So we've been learning about the geology of the alluvial fan that created our vineyard. And so what makes it unique is that we're at the very base. So the most rocky, gravelly material falls off first because it's heavier as the streams flow down and deposit erosion. And we're sitting on this gravel bed where you can actually see where the ancient streams run when you dig down in the soil. And what that does is it focuses the energy of our plants on ripening the fruit instead of growing vegetatively. So we've been really grateful just by pure luck that we landed on a very special spot.
Yeah, and at the beginning, your family was selling grapes, right? Like most families.
Yeah, so when we got into it, the family lore is that we were first going to sell grapes to Beaulieu, and right before that, my granddad tried to go in there and renegotiate a price that would cover our expenses, which was a novel idea back then. So they said, "See you later, take a hike." So we ended up hearing that Bob Mondavi, who was working for his family's Charles Krug winery at the time, was looking for grapes. And so what ended up happening was my great uncle was a lawyer. So he was the family lawyer, and he wrote a grape contract for 3 years at a set price. And I looked it up. It was for $165 per ton. And
can I just interrupt you for a second? We're talking the 1950s probably, right?
Yeah, exactly.
54.
Because Mondavi's the mid 60s. So this is 50s.
Yeah, this is pre Robert Mondavi winery.
Yeah.
This was when they sold the Shannon that Tegan loved.
Yeah, so we ended up getting into a 3-year agreement at that price. And the very first year, there was a glut of grapes in the valley. So the market value skyrocketed to closer to $200 a ton. So our family was kicking themselves thinking we screwed up getting into the grape business. And so when we got the check in the mail from Bob Mondavi, it wasn't for our contracted price, it was for the market value. And the next year, the exact same thing happened. The price went up. Regardless of the agreement we had, Bob paid us the fair market value. So our great uncle went into his office at Krug with the contract that he'd written and rips it up in front of him, puts it on his desk and says, "Bob, we don't need a contract, just a handshake."
And that's really remained that way for quite some time, obviously.
Yeah.
But
we did 50 years with the Mondavi family just based off that handshake, which was pretty special. And then since the family sold in 04, we've been selling the grapes exclusively to Constellation Brands for the Robert Mondavi Reserve and To Kalon wine. So it's a very long lasting relationship.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. And then, of course, even before your family owned that piece of land, obviously To Kalon is one of the historic pieces of land in Napa Valley. It's a really magical place. You mentioned the alluvial fan. Do you think is that the most special part, or is it also the weather, the climate? What is there a set of things, or is it mostly what's underneath the ground?
It's everything. I think the soil is magical because there's so much unknown. But I think it's the human legacy. For me, it's the history draws me in more than anything. And part of that is in our family, managing the property basically skipped a generation from my grandfather. And then my parents' generation just recently started managing it. And so to understand what we had, it took a lot of research. I felt connected to the early players, the visionaries, the people who tried to carve something special out of this property. And I think we're building what we're doing on a foundation of 100 years of history beyond our family.
Or going back, obviously, you're talking 1850s to 1950s, more or less.
Exactly. Yeah. So there were 100 years of data before we even started.
Yeah. So for folks who are watching who may not know, you guys have done a tremendous job in sort of reconstructing the history of this piece of land. I know that when Alessandro and I were working on the map, we spent a lot of time talking to you and a bunch of other people, obviously, but it's pretty remarkable because it's To Kalon is one of the few places in Napa Valley where you can go back to many generations back. In a different time when it wasn't just wine, it was lots of different crops. And
exactly. And what makes that what makes that so exciting is it has also been famous in every single era of Napa wine history. And as you know, tasting back through time, the styles of winemaking have changed, even the varietals. And my favorite component of that is that To Kalon was famous pre-prohibition for one of the most famous wines in the world, but it was Refosco, an Italian varietal. So the Cabernet is a more recent development.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that, to think, I mean, here we are in 2020, when you go to Napa Valley, it's Cabernet, 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 but people forget that there was once a lot of Petit Syrah and all sorts of other varieties. Refosco, I'm less familiar with, but I'm sure that I've never tasted one from Tokalan, but obviously there's the Sauvignon Blanc, there's the Chenin, and then there's one vineyard that's not too far from you, the Oakville Farmhouse, that still has a lot of these varieties planted, and it's maybe the only vineyard like that left in Napa Valley, or at least in what most people would sort of define as the Tenderloin. No, or are there others?
Well, it's certainly the oldest vineyard in Oakville, and I've had the luxury of Morgan and Chris and their team inviting me out to help prune there, and it's incredibly special. They refer to their there's debate whether the Refosco was Mondavi's, but the name that Crab gave it, who proprietor Tokalan, was Crab's Black Burgundy. So we've seen those vines and pruned them, and it's incredibly special also because it's in just such high priced real estate. You have Promontory on one side of Oakville Farmhouse, you have Harlan Estate on the other, Futo, and you can buy a $70 bottle of Oakville mixed blacks with Negrette and all sorts of other varieties. It's a real bargain. One of our favorites.
Yeah, it's a really special bottle of wine too, because Graeme and I we love what Morgan and Chris are doing over at Bedrock with everything, but that vineyard to us is so cool because you taste that wine and it has a sense of Oakville. And even though it's all these different varietals, it still is able to showcase that sense of place, which is a testament to what they're doing over there.
Yeah, and so the mixed blacks is a term used to describe a vineyard that's interplanted with lots of different varieties, and that is almost always picked together and fermented together in a style that immigrant families thought would, I guess they were thinking that the varieties would be complementary to each other in terms of the final blend. And that was probably the extent of what people's knowledge was back then in the 1880s or early 1900s when most of these vineyards were planted. I forget the exact date on that one, but so don't quiz me, but more or less we're talking a long time ago.
You can ask Morgan on Friday.
Morgan or Tegan, all those people blow me away on history. Tasting with them is really humbling every year. That's for sure. Okay, so your vineyard is, so now moving back to like present day, your vineyard is also distinguished because you've got some vineyards that are dry farmed and sort of California sprawl, which are the ones that everybody sees on the pictures. And then you've got another section that's like more modern. So what differences do you note in the different parts of the vineyard? Are the harvest times very different? Is it more a question of training and light exposure, berry size? I mean, what really is the difference?
Yeah, it's fascinating because not everyone gets an opportunity to try all these different styles. When we first started producing our wine, that was one of the goals, is to see what works, choose the best that we can for ourselves. And so I've fallen in love. We have more than half the vineyard is California sprawl, which is basically untrellised. We let the vines grow and then weep down. And so what it does is it not only regulates the growth of the plant by telling the hormonal symptoms to stop growing, but it also protects the fruit from sun. And so I think in California, the real connection that we've had to the Napa Valley, California sprawl, has been that sun protection. So we retain qualities in our wine of freshness, and they're technically pyrazines, but that sort of Cabernet varietal character is retained, and one of the more stable chemical compounds. We have home wines that we made back in the 70s with the Isley family, where we were doing 50-50 blends of our two vineyards and drinking them at home. There's not that many of those that still exist, but what makes those so special is back then that pyrazine character is basically smells the same way that it did when it was bottled. So it's just an incredibly prolific compound in wine. And if we keep the fruit in the sun and just try to bake out all those flavors, because it's an inverse relationship, you end up losing the varietal character and losing the ageability in the wine, in our opinion.
Yeah, and when you let the vines kind of do what they want to do naturally with that kind of head train canopy, it allows for the perfect amount of dappled sunlight to come through, versus when you start, changing things in the vineyard, usually change one thing you're trying to, and then 50 other things that we don't really understand are going to change as well. So we've kind of discovered the more natural and less manipulative, usually the more consistent and the better the quality as well.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I can only imagine what a wine that's half Tokalan from your vineyard at Isley's like. That's got to be like a really life-changing wine. I've never had it. If there's ever one open, the next time I stop by. No. But so the reason that these head trained vineyards don't exist very much anymore is because there was a time in the 80s and 90s, maybe even before, but when people thought you wanted to give vineyards sunlight, you wanted to have densely planted vineyards to encourage competition, you wanted the vines to be super stressed. Today, it's obviously very different, but you have a heritage site of which there are not very many left, especially not in Napa Valley. I mean, you see them more in Sonoma. This is more common, this style, and in other places, but in Napa, it's pretty rare to see that kind of training like that. There's not too many sites left. Maybe Kronos, I think, is like that, and there's not a whole lot.
Yeah, our grandmother always thought it was the most beautiful way to do it. So when Bob Mondavi wanted to start planting more density, she said, I don't think it looks pretty enough. And that was one of the main decision factors.
Wow, cool. So speaking of Mondavi, when you taste those wines they're made with your grapes, but not exclusively with your grapes. They're made, obviously they are buying from various sources. Can you pick out a trait that's yours, or is it just you feel like it's washed out?
So the highest percentage of our grapes goes into a bottle they have just labeled To Kalon. It's got an etched sort of leaf on it, black bottle with sold mostly in the taste room. And so that on a typical year is 50 to 90% from our vineyard. So that's a really strong comparison. And then the reserve depends on the vintage. Between us and our cousins, at its peak, we were probably about 20% of that blend. And the way it was described to us by the winemaker is that she used to use our grapes as a backbone and pour in little drips here or there to completely change the blend. So I do think there's a character, but I would describe our site within the context of To Kalon as just has tons of austerity, minerality, the sort of the graphite quality, and it tends to be much more powerful because of that gravel. So I think they've used that very successfully over the years to affect their blends. But that being said, a lot of their vineyards go into it as well.
Yeah, we sort of skipped over a little bit of this history because when you referred to your cousins, you're talking about the Dietert parcel.
Yes, exactly. So they're second cousins.
Yeah, that was once part of your broader family once owned both pieces together, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, we share great grandparents.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're making really good wine there too. Speaking of wine, we got a ton of questions, so this is going to be really fun. But I opened this wine, which is 2012, and what I'm amazed about with this wine is, 2012 is not my favorite Napa Valley vintage, to be honest. I thought that the wines were a little bit light. And I'm not talking about your wine, I'm just talking in general. I thought the wines were a little bit light, not that complex, not that interesting, just, relative to 13, 14. But your wine has really put on a lot of weight. I haven't tasted it in a couple of years, so it's pretty surprising to me. I'm sure that you taste it much more often, so it's not a surprise to you. But tell us a little bit about how your wines are made. And then what is it about them that allows them to, how does that happen that wine just has put on all this weight? It didn't have that a few years ago. I'm not that old. My memory's still pretty good. So what's the deal?
It's interesting. I'd say the first to start off with the philosophy. After I graduated from Davis, I haven't read a textbook. All I read is philosophy now. I feel like I can get better answers towards why things work out in the way they do studying that. And the theory we have in regards to our vineyard and our grapes is it's really doing it ourselves. And the idea is capturing the sense of place. So the way we achieve that is I like to use the analogy. If you've ever had a wild strawberry or a wild blackberry from a native creek, there's just this vitality and life in that fruit that you can reassess any moment you want to remember it. And so I truly believe that we have to farm our grapes as close to naturally as possible. So when I took over, 2012 was actually the first year that I took over farming. And I will say, thank goodness for my family, my mentors, but I didn't have a whole lot of an idea of what I was doing. And it even required
it's okay.
Yeah. My family was very nervous. So I actually had one of my mentors, John Consgard. He came over to our house, sat down at the table with me, and met with the whole family in order to say, if Graeme needs anything, we have his back. We'll make sure he doesn't fall on his face. And then as John was leaving, he gave me a pat on the back and said, "All right, good luck." So we've been very, very grateful for that, and our family taking the risk. And so that was a very forgiving growing season, as you make reference to. It had late spring rain, the canopies were big, the fruit was big. And so the way we make the wine, the way we achieve that is really about as little intervention in the vineyard as possible. We haven't fertilized our vineyard in 20 years. I mean, it's all cover crop. And we basically take the fruit as is. I manage it only to the point of not letting nature take back the fruit, which we have to have something left to make wine from. But then we bring it up again to John Consgard's winery. He was very generous when we started down this path. He said, I have to build a winery, and there's a wing if you need it, so you can make wine the way you should, which is with your own hands by yourself. And so we were very grateful for that. He now refers to it as the kids' corner. So we're up there in a wing at the Consgard Cave. And the same thing with winemaking. I feel like these are long, extended macerations. And the idea behind that is to capture the energy that the vine puts into the seed. I think that's a very important characteristic in the site. And it comes across as like a bitter chocolate, a very sort of dark, rich aroma. And then the winemaking is all for our own hands. I think you went up there once, unbeknownst to us, to taste the Consgard wines, and you saw our sorting line, which was me, my wife, my kids are eating the grapes, my mom's there helping sort, Alex is there, whoever Alex was dating at the time. It was pretty family affair.
But it's great to see that, wines are made by people, because as not just in Napa, but in other places, a lot of wines are made more by well, first of all, Napa Valley has a very big custom crush industry, which is where you basically give somebody a work order and they do your pump overs and blah, blah, blah. That to me is like asking, like a chef telling somebody to cook something without them actually touching things. And I'm sure that you can make good wine, and some great wines have been made like that, but I think you have to be exceptional, and some people are exceptional, obviously. So it's always good to see, I always look to see, like, I want to see like hands that are purple, and I want to see like really dirty nails. I'm like, okay, I'm probably going to like this wine. So no, that was that day. Yeah. Because I always taste it. It's always my last appointment because it's so far away. I don't know how you do that back and forth, but anyway, Kongsgard is at the top of Atlas Peak, and I always go and taste there every year, but it's a drive. So after that, it's okay. But yeah, I did run into you at that one year making the wine. So that's great.
It's worth the drive if you're able to do everything with your own hands. I think that's definitely something Graeme and I would agree on.
Well, I'm sure it is, because it's hard to, you make about 300 cases or so, more or less, right?
Yeah, little closer to 400 with what's coming out this spring.
Okay, so 400
excuse me, fall.
So it's not easy to find places to make that volume of wine.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, when we first started, which was one of the reasons we were so thankful for John giving us space, was we were reaching out to all these different custom crush facilities and trying to get in there. And some of them either said, you're too small, it's not worth even dealing with, or they would charge us some minimum amount that was, not economical for what we were doing. And like you even hinted at, it's being able to do your own work is such an important part to make the wine the way that you want to. And John has been, unbelievable in giving us the chance to do that. And we're both very, very thankful for everything we've been able to do up there at that winery.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, before I want to know what you're drinking, but before that, I'm surprised because I don't think I knew that the 2012 was the first vintage that you actually farmed, because the first vintage that I tasted of yours was the 2010,
Mm-hmm.
which I loved and loved. I just haven't had it in a while, because what I do with the wines I really like is I put them in offsite storage because I have no discipline. But the problem with that is, well, not that, we don't have pandemics like every month, but obviously when you want something, it's not so easy to get. But so tell us, so the 10 is, what is it about that? Because what I loved about that wine is it just had this incredible energy. So what was it about that wine? I mean, you didn't even control the farming. You did it in family, but not you personally. So how did that wine turn out the way it turned out?
So we actually had started making the wine in 2004 because I wanted to experiment. So every year I did something different. One year it was high ripeness, one year it was low, one year it was new oak, one year it was neutral. So 10 was the first vintage where I think we were starting to stress economically, because the way it works in our family is there's no nepotism. So we get to pay full price that anyone else would pay for the fruit. And so we got to a point where Alex and I wrote him a check that was 3 times the size of our life savings in the bank account. And so we decided it was time to release the 2010 being our favorite of everything we produced up to that point. And I love that wine too, because it really captures the energy, the vitality, and the idea behind releasing that vintage and drinking the rest ourselves was because we wanted that first step, this like the equivalent of the 66 Mondavi or the 79 Opus. We wanted our first wine to be prolific and to make that statement. And I specifically remember you came and tasted it pretty much before everyone, and I was so nervous that I kept asking, "What do you think? What do you think? What do you think?" And I will never forget you said, "I've never tasted anything like this," which caused me to have an internal spiral of whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. But I was very grateful that you enjoyed it.
No, I enjoyed it quite a bit. In fact, I didn't tell you guys this, ahead of time, but in about 2013 or 14, I don't remember exactly, but we did a tasting of 2010 Napa Cabernets for our readers. And I wasn't the first person to taste it because I found out about your wine on the Vinous user forum. So the people who I should thank are like your very earliest fans, because I read about your wine on our website on the forum, and I'm like, okay, that's intriguing. I have to go check it out. But in 2013 or so, we did this tasting, and we had all of these. I don't remember exactly all the wines that we had, but we had Diamond Creek, I remember, and there was Cap Shandy Grand Vin, and there was Blanquier and Schaefer Hillside Select, and there was I think it was Bond Vicina. Anyway, we had all these wines, and when people come to our tastings, I always want them to be something special, something you can't get somewhere else. So we put in a wine blind, and it was your wine. And Scott Becker from Realm is very proud that he took on. But it was quite that. I mean, that was because I also, when you go visit a winery, we're human. You're sort of taken in by the whole thing. And I want to see, it's fun to taste wines together, not because it's competitive. I never think of wine as a competitive thing, but I just want to know what the playing field is. And that was a really eye-opening experience. So I always love the 10. But a bunch of people are asking what you guys are drinking. So which vintage are you guys drinking?
We opened a bottle of the 17 since we can't taste anybody on the wine right now. We thought we might as well check in on ourselves. But this is the wine I was mentioning. It was 392 cases, and this will be what we released later this year in September. But it's fun to check in on the wines young and just kind of follow them. And between Graeme and I think, throughout the rest of the afternoon, we'll probably keep pouring ourselves some glasses and see how it continues to change, which was always kind of a fun thing to do.
Well, that one has already changed quite a bit, because I remember the first time I tasted it was very light. I mean, within the context of Napa Valley. And I think a lot of people forget that the heat spikes were much more a determining factor. I mean, obviously, if you couldn't get to your wine for 3 weeks at post 2017 harvest, or if your vineyard was smoke tainted, that's a different story. But for people who were able to make their wines as you were, the biggest issue is really the blocking of maturation in the field, which is counterintuitive because you think hot year, the wines are going to be very rich. So what can you explain for folks who are watching, what happens when it's really hot? What's the effect to the vineyard?
So the vines transpire, that they release water, try to regulate their temperature. So in vineyards where you're irrigating, one of the tricks is you can go through and you can feel the leaves and decide if they need water. Because if the leaves are hot, it's not transpiring correctly because it's overheating. So it's kind of like a human in many cases. As you stand out in the sun, you get heat exhaustion. So when you get those really extended, high spiked temperatures that have been more common as of recent, it's a real challenge for the plant because they basically stop production and maturation of their fruit. They get nervous and focus more on survival. So what you get is a delay in the phenologic ripening of the fruit. And so it's a very challenging thing as a winemaker, because you're dealing with fruit that chemistry wise might look totally normal, but taste wise is quite different. And so the way we manage that, and for example in 17, and how you can come across with a wine that shows a sense of place, is we basically relied very heavily in the blend on the 45 and 65-year-old vines. So the ones with the California sprawl, the shaded canopy, so that fruit was not baking in the sun. It was more protected. And I do think that that's the key to retaining the elegance in those hotter vintages. And you'll see, I think over time, Napa Valley will go away from the vertical shoot positioning and back towards additional sun protection on the fruit, or shade cloth as other places are embracing as well.
Yeah. Also dry farming, I think, in that vintage and having those old vines made a huge difference, because those vines have tapped so deep into the soils that they've connected to the natural water table in most areas. So it gives them a chance to have a little bit of extra water during those really, really significant heat spikes that maybe vineyards that are raised off irrigation don't have. So that, I think, added a little bit of elegance and balance in that vintage for us as well.
Yeah, and for folks who are watching, when you talk about phenological ripeness, you're talking about the ripeness of the skins and the seeds. And,
yes.
And so what you have in 17, as you say, the vine sort of freaks out. It shifts its energy to survival. It stops ripening. The sugars, though, may continue to go up. So now you're out of balance. Then you have to make a decision about picking, which is very complicated. Yeah. And then right around harvest that year was the year that you had bricks going back in a lot of places. I'm not sure if that happened to you, but it was very common in that year for the Valley. And a lot of winemakers told me they had never seen that before. So that means the bricks, which is that measurement of ripeness, is retreat, is going backwards, which I'm sure causes people like to really freak out. And that's why the 17s in Napa Valley in a hot year are lower in alcohol and lighter bodied wines, just generally as a whole, because of this phenomenon, which is, I think, pretty neat. You know, it's a pretty distinguishing factor.
Yeah, and I think our wines also express vintage. That's a goal. Part of the sense of place is like, I want every single vintage to taste unique. I don't want to try to make a homogenized product or try to adapt in the winery. And so I think that's been one of our big successes, is you capture these moments in time and you don't try to work the wine in order to turn it into something it's not. So part of the pleasure in tasting this is versus all the other 17s I've tasted is we were so lucky to have that classic California sprawl. I think it's the key to succeeding in a hotter climate.
So cool. So let's geek out a little bit. Curious, for farming, cover crops, and like, what's your view on, not biodynamics per se, but you said you haven't fertilized in 20 years. So what is the farming regime at MacDonald in the Vineyard?
So the biggest influence for me, I've read all the Rudolf Steiner, the biodynamic books, the permaculture. I'm a voracious reader when it comes to all the different philosophies. And the one that resonated the most was a Japanese citrus and rice farmer named Masanobu Fukuoka. And it's a book about terroir that was recommended to me by Christopher Howell up on his Mountain and Cane winery. And I love this book because it's about do nothing farming. So it challenges everything you do in order to obscure the sense of place that'll come across alternatively. And that said, his philosophy is you don't need to prune, but if we don't prune vines, we don't get clusters. We get a berry here and a berry there, and it doesn't actually work. So the beauty of vineyards is it's more of a balance. You get to interact. There's a man-made aspect to the process, but I think challenging yourself not to fertigate, which is something where you inject fertilizer through the drip system, causes the berries to swell, causes the vines to change. And I'd say it was a small thing, but the most powerful change for me, where I started to open my eyes to this, was I was incredibly nervous about releasing our wine when we were starting. I was trying to hoard it all and keep it for myself, I think. And Alex and various mentors had to pressure me. And part of it was with our limited family budget, how are we going to compete on the scale of where I think these wines sit in the context of Napa? And one of my mentors heard me complaining about this, and he said, "Graeme, you drive your own tractor, your wines are going to be fantastic." And so I think it stemmed back to that. Is even later on today I'll be hoe plowing, so it's important to connect to your vineyard, to drive through it. You see every vine, as where most people probably need earbuds in to keep entertained as they're driving their tractor. I've never listened to a lick of music. I just sit there and take it all in. It's truly, I think, what makes what we do special.
Yeah, one of the cool things I've noticed, and it continues to evolve with Graeme when he reads more philosophical books, But it's, you have vintage to vintage variation. So why would you farm anything the same way every year? And it's been pretty cool seeing the different influence of whether it's a book that somebody, told us to read, or a mentor from different parts of the wine industries throughout the world that have kind of added some knowledge throughout the way. But it's kind of important for us to learn as much as we possibly can from, all these different facets, and then be able to use that information when it applies, vintage to vintage. Because there might be something that Graeme decides to do in the vineyard this year that he maybe has never done before, but talking to people that have done it previously, it gives you that confidence and understanding that it could work in that situation, which I think is important, to be adaptive in those things.
What about green harvesting? Does that vineyard require green harvesting, or does it set the crop naturally that's close to sort of what you're looking for?
So the vines that are 45 years and older set, and it's usually 1.5 tons per acre. And in the 65-year-old vines, it's maybe 1 ton per acre. So those are very minimal, only if things are congested or we can't get spacing. And then our young vines, which are now turning 20, those are ones that they've still got that youthful enthusiasm, and they try to set more crop and try to show off. And so we do thin those in order to concentrate the fruit. And so when we blend our wines, it's now somewhat of a mix, where the 45 and the 65-year-old vines tend to have more of that austerity and that sort of backwards aspect. And then the 20-year-old give us that youthful vibrancy in the fruit, and add some aromatic that tops it off. It's really fun to blend.
Yeah, and so for context, for folks watching, on a valley floor, well, for high quality wine in the United States, 2 tons per acre would be considered yields for a very high quality wine. But in the valley floor, especially in abundant vintage, you could get 6, 7, 8 tons per acre easily on valley floor. I think that certainly happened in 2018, but that's kind of a story for another day. But you're at kind of, those are sort of like mountain yields, 1 to 1.5 tons per acre. That's kind of what you get like in Pritchard Hill. So it's pretty low naturally. And then, so you talked about in the winery, long time on the skins. Temperature, high, low, how does that play into your decision of how long to leave the wine on skins?
I tend to let the temperature creep up into the 90 degree area. I'm not afraid of a little bit of extraction coming from the temperature. And the reason for that is actually a Vinous video. It's you interviewed one of my favorite winemakers, which is Philip Tony, about his 1969 Chapelet, which we had very graciously with a friend who you know well, and he said that fermentation got away from him, and so that crept up to 100 degrees, which is very risky from a yeast health standpoint at that point. But I've always been a little bit more towards letting the fermentations rise and then cooling as necessary, but not being too warm.
Okay, and then after that, then what happens?
So there's a lot of tasting that goes on in between, a lot of worrying, because when you're fermenting a wine, that's the real risky time period, and things can change very quickly. So it's me tasting multiple times a day, worrying about it. I usually worry so I don't have to actually intervene or do anything, but a lot of it is just smelling the tops of the tanks, really just gauging how the yeast are doing, tracking the fermentation through charting, and we'll drain it off basically when it starts to pick up that bitter chocolate flavor, because I know we're getting seed extraction, because part of the downside of extensive seed extraction is you start to get bitterness, and I like to have that little bit of intensity from the seeds, but I don't want it to taste like coffee grounds. So that's a very technical based on feel decision. And then we barrel down the tanks so they drain as they go directly into barrels. So each barrel is theoretically then a different cut of the tank. So when you taste through the barrels, then you get a whole nother variation. One of the things we don't do is we don't include any press wine. So it's about a 20 to 30% deselection based on that. We usually bottle it a barrel or two for our mother, so that we can sell the rest of the wine and not drink away our profits. Although we'd love to do that too. And then we just do, nothing's formulaic. Everything in the winery. My main concern from a philosophical standpoint in the winery is that it can be somewhat industrial when you have all these stainless steel things and pumps. And so we really want to retain the magic of the vineyard. So there's nothing that's on a schedule. It's all by taste and by feel. And every racking is based on how the wine is smelling. If it needs some air, then we'll give it some air, but nothing on a schedule.
And judging by the natural richness of this wine, there's just a question about RO. I'm assuming that there's no reverse osmosis. I mean, these wines are so powerful.
Never, no Saignée, no reverse osmosis, no real science from a standpoint. I learned that at one of the natural wine facilities that I worked at is reliance on your own palate. So that's the one thing. Again, it's an intervention that I think would be more to homogenize various vintages. And I remember a friend in the industry, when he tasted that 12, he said, "Oh, wow, what did you do to this wine? Because you got so much concentration." And I said, "We didn't do anything. I just put it in the tank and let it ferment and tried to capture the general intensity of the site."
Same thing with acids, I imagine.
Yeah, never added any acid. Really, the concern for me is when you start manipulating those types of things or base your decisions based on numbers, you can risk obscuring what's naturally in there. And with old vines, we retain really strong acidity and freshness in the wines. So I've never felt like our wines have lacked in acidity. I feel like the ideal for me is to have this wine that you sip and it feels light on the palate and intense on the finish. And so I think that's where we've been really managing our winemaking according to what we think the vineyard wants us to do.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. And then what about oak, just to finish the geeky stuff? We're going to talk about history.
Yeah, so it's a mixture, mostly Taranceau and Sylvain, we had the luxury at Mondavi when I got to go in and taste our family wines from there. They had our wine in just about everything. So I got to, for years, taste through different coopers. And so I chose the two that I felt like were the most subtle. And then I also rinse them with hot water, try to get all the oak flavor out, because really what I like about the oak is the oxygenation capacity of the barrel's breathing versus a used barrel. But that said, we're probably 75% new versus used, which is a percentage that's slowly trickled down as I try to match the site to the barrels as well. And every year that changes depending on how concentrated I feel like the vintage is.
Yeah, most of our friends up at the winery look at Graeme power washing the inside of these barrels that we just spent all this money on, thinking that we're absolute, crazy people. But it's a good way to minimize the oak influence on the wine and let the site shine through while still using the oxidative exchange of the new oak barrels for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you guys mentioned something at the beginning of our conversation, which was the pyrazine character, but I don't really pick that up in your wines at all.
Yeah, I would say we get it to a stage where it comes across more of like a black olive. And you can think of the way wines transition flavor-wise. You go from the mint to the herbal to the black olive to the light red fruit, black fruit, violets. And so really after all that experimentation, what we enjoyed drinking the most were balance. And so we like to incorporate all of the sort of different components into the wine. And I think that's where I don't want anything to stand out particularly, but I want it to be present in the wine. And some days it shows itself more than others.
Yeah, because these things operate on a continuum, right? It's not black and white. It's like infinite shades of gray. And you're making a decision on the picking decision. I imagine it's mostly tasting and not so much lab driven, yep. Correct?
Yeah, and I'm obsessive. You taste all the time. You pick little sections. It's like a vegetable garden where you just pick the areas that are ready, and then if you're lucky enough with a facility that allows it, you get to micromanage how you pick your vineyard.
Yeah, that's cool. I know that you taste a lot of wines that are made by other people. So, what are your favorite wines that are not so well known? Not necessarily. I mean, it'd be obviously Napa, that just the general prices are pretty high, but what are a couple wines that you like that are sort of made by your friends or your colleagues that most people haven't heard about or that you think are really special? I'm curious, then we can compare.
Yeah, so couple really under the radar ones. We drink a lot of Bedrock in our house. The Oakville Farmhouse is one of our favorite values for being so close to $800 country. And then some of the other recent favorites, Revic wine company. He's related to the Arno Roberts team. Desire Lines Wines. Cody is Morgan's assistant winemaker. I feel like the more wines that I buy are this next generation of people starting to get excited about wine and wines that we can drink on a daily basis, because we can't afford to do that on our own wines.
Yeah, we like, Tegan doesn't make enough for us to drink enough when we want it, but Tegan's been making some really cool wines. A buddy of mine works down in Santa Barbara at Aubon Clement Winery, a guy named Mark Piro. He's making some really cool Pinot and Chard down there. But it feels good to support friends, and it's kind of going back to what Graeme was saying when it came to like not making any sort of changes to the wines. We've talked to our friends that have been able to start small brands in other areas, and they say, well, if we had To Kalon fruit, we wouldn't have to be making any manipulations either. So it's fun to see what they're doing and have a chance to learn from people making wines from other areas too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question here is about under $100 wines. I think if I had to pick mine that I like a lot of times, it's like I like Massimo di Costanzo's wines a lot.
Yeah, he's a cool guy.
I like the Round Pond wines, especially the simpler wines, because they're not quite as hefty and concentrated. And that's a big production vineyard. And I'm sure you guys know in Rutherford, in a lot of parts of it, but there's some parts that are more farmed for these higher end wines. And I just think their Reserve, for example, is a beautiful, not too crazy wine. Frog's Leap is reliably good.
Yeah,
love that. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that there are definitely places where you can find value in Napa Valley wines without the super, super expensive wines. And you mentioned a couple Desire Lines, which we just published reviews on those wines. I think it was last week. And Mark Piro, I taste his wines every year. So that's Pinot Noir from Santa Barbara. But there's a lot in California and Napa that's off the beaten track. So now I have to ask you, I mean, this could take up like a whole other episode. So it may, but obviously you're super connected to the land and you have this incredible jewel of a vineyard. And obviously it's been this very long saga about, can you use the name of your of where you are, To Kalon, on your label. So what is the latest on that situation, if you can say?
I'm going to pour myself another glass for this one.
Okay. Pick the bottle. I think you need the bottle.
Yeah. So the exciting thing about that was I sort of landed myself in the hot seat, because part of figuring out what our role is, and we have a family history, which is that our great uncle was also a wine historian, and he was the president of a thing called the Napa Valley Wine Library, which is a lot of the oral histories and important things that we've retained from Valley history. And so I got incredibly interested when I found his 1978 To Kalon historical report, which is the first of its kind. And then as I started to research and ask people questions, it was told to me that our great uncle Gunther was one of the ones who convinced Bob to resurrect the To Kalon name in the 1980s. So for me, as I discussed earlier, it's a genealogical question. I love, as someone would, studying their genealogy, learning about the land. And so in doing that, we did a historic American landscape survey, which has been a hobby of mine, a National Register nomination. We named our little creek To Kalon Creek with the geologist who wrote the Winemaker's Dance in order to sort of start applying place names to alluvial fans, which he had started in scientific papers. And all this was great and going well and been fun. And then one of our other neighbors who owns a parcel that was owned by Crab that's non-contiguous started suing Constellation in order to retain rights to the name. So what ended up happening is, unbeknownst to us, Constellation has decided to further their litigious argument that they would start to wipe the slate clean of any evidence of To Kalon as a place. And so it started with the creek name, the National Register nomination. And so the idea that they're promoting is that To Kalon's a brand, not a place, and that they reserve the right to name any wine from anywhere in the world To Kalon.
Yeah, so you've just basically told us an enormous amount, but to sort of fill in, the last piece was that famous quote from Tim Mondavi, where he said he could make the wines from Kenya, I think, grapes from Kenya,
Yeah.
and To Kalon.
Nairobi, but yeah.
Nairobi, sorry. Well, not too far off. I have had a whole glass of Cabernet, and it's the end of the day here, so forgive me. Yeah, okay. And then when you drive by the Robert Mondavi winery, which by the way is, I mean, he tore up Vineyard, as I recall, to build that vineyard. I think it was in 1966, but you will know better than me. When you drive past there, it says Tokalan Vineyard on their own, entrance to the winery, right? So it's obviously confusing to understand what the deal is. And then then this latest lawsuit that you mentioned, that is the property. If you want to look on our map, it's the property called the Vineyard House, correct?
Yeah.
And the fundamental question is, I think, but I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but as I understand, the fundamental question here is what was actually planted with grapes during the life of Crab, who was the original owner of this land or some portion of the land, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so that's pretty good. So it's pretty complex and there's lots of different layers to it. But your fruit, goes into a wine with the name Tokalan.
Yeah, and that's the oddity. We are not allowed to put Tokalan on our personal wine label, but all the fruit we sell to Mondavi is designated as the Tokalan Vineyard. So it's as a consumer, I can imagine we're going down a very confusing pathway in regards to what is a place. And if I can quote you, I think that you said it best. You posted on Instagram a while back when we sent out our release letter. You said the idea of place in American wine is so important. It's the only way for us to build multi-generational family value in the land. And I think that's the best way to phrase it, in that we've landed in this discussion of our historic place names physical, or are they just intellectual property? And I think with how wine is discussed and how we appreciate the history and our family's connection to the land, it didn't sit well with us to be going down a pathway to say that this vineyard that we've been talking about actually doesn't exist. And go ahead, Antonio.
No, I'm just listening. I'm just engaged.
And it came to a head when so as we realized that all of our historical work to preserve the vineyard, which is the ultimate goal, is to document it historically, to preserve it for future generations, not only of our family, but of people in the valley. We got called into a meeting with Constellation, and Alex and I were a little over our heads. It was the two of us, and they flew in their legal team from New York and their heads at Mondavi. And in that meeting, it was very interesting because they offered us, in exchange for a letter to overturn the name Tokalan Creek, that we could license the rights. They'd give us licensing rights to use Tokalan on our label. And I conferred with Alex beforehand, saying that if he's comfortable, I could answer on the spot. And it took about 10 seconds. And I told him, I said, our integrity is not for sale. So that meeting spiraled downhill very quick. But I think it emphasized what's important to us. And I think it's an important precedent in Tokalan to be set for American wine, because if we let some of these large wine conglomerates come in and change the meaning of place, and to explain that wines are actually disconnected and that they own the history or can change it, I think that's a huge problem for the future generations.
Yeah, well, obviously having principles is admirable. So congratulations. And, so my view for folks who don't know what we're talking about is basically, what you want, if you're an advocate for just the heritage of Napa Valley or any region in the United States, is, and I came to this, by obviously talking to lots of people and visiting lots of wineries and visiting lots of vineyards and doing our maps. But basically, if you love these wines, what you want is that a property like Tokalan one day is like Richebourg or Clos de Bez or Canubi. And for us, the folks on this call, it for sure is, but you want it to be sort of more broadcast into the world. And I think that once a place, my sort of idea, my working thesis is, once a place appears on a label, you can't change, you should not be able to change the name with ownership. And these places are places, they're very real places. And if you establish that, then over the generation, you can create, I think, you're in a really good position to build multicultural value in land. And that is legacy, and that is what makes wines coveted. Of course, what's in the bottle has to be great, but I'm taking that as a given here. But this is super important. And I look at constantly what other people do, and I get criticized a lot for it. But a very good example is Islay Vineyard, which in 2013 or 14 or so was bought by Mr. Pinot, who owns a company called Artemis, which owns Latour, Chateau Latour in Bordeaux. And one of the first things he did was he changed the name he bought the Araujo estate. Everybody was doing the math. Oh, how many bottles of wine does Araujo estate produce? And this math doesn't work out. And this is a crazy valuation and blah, 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 blah. But Mr. Pinot, who's a billionaire, which means he's smarter than, I know he's smarter than me. I don't know about guys on the call, but he's smarter than me for sure. He wasn't buying Araujo estate, and he wasn't doing the math on how much wine they make. He was doing the math on buying a legacy piece of land called Islay Vineyard. And as soon as he had the opportunity, he changed the name back to Islay Vineyard, because that's really what I hate to use the word brand, but that's really the value of that place is Islay Vineyard, one of the most historic ranches in Napa Valley. And when you see people do that, I think it's an indication of, somebody with a different kind of culture sort of saying, hey, the value is really the land. No disrespect to Bart and Daphne, who did a great job there, obviously, but they owned it for 20 years or so. So they were sort of stewards of it during a period. But land is a hard asset. That vineyard, that'll be there. I mean, we'll probably live very long lives, but these places will be here long after us. And therefore, I think that, that was what you were talking about, but that's just my belief that you have to really preserve the value of land, because that's what survives all of us for multiple generations. And that's what creates culture, so that not just wines from Tokalam, but all of those those great vineyards in Napa Valley, that they're revered in 50, 100, 200 years. So.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting and spot on approach to it. I think another thing to point out, just to kind of specify the history of it all, is Napa was really built off the model. And a lot of people were comparing themselves to, and you even look at Opus with the Rothschilds and like you just mentioned, Islay getting bought out by the people in Latour. But people used to talk about Robert Mondavi, they talked about Inglenook, they talked about Krug, Behringer, Christian Brothers, but nobody even really understood where the vineyards were. And that's completely shifted in the last, 15, 20 years to being much more focused on, is it coming from Tokalam? Is it Pritchard Hill? Is it Dr. Crane? Is it Las Piedras? And I think the kind of shift in interest and understanding of wine from a consumer base is hopefully pushing that discussion in the positive direction going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely where the direction that we're going in with this proliferation of single vineyard wines from all of these vineyards that you just mentioned. We're like right up against our time limit. So I just want to thank you both very much for being on this show with me and sharing your history and your knowledge. I think we couldn't, not a second episode. We could do like 3, 4, 5. So we might be getting you up again, but thanks so much for your time. And thanks to everybody who watched. We had so many questions that we couldn't get to. I'll try to answer as many of these as I can in writing here or in articles, but thanks again for your time. And really looking forward to seeing you in person on the other side of this COVID thing. But cheers, and thanks, guys, very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for making the time for us, Antonio, and including us on everything.
Okay. Cheers. Thanks for watching, guys.